I want first, though, to move on to thinking about Shakespeare's movement between prose and verse and what this might tell us about the realism of his speech. The play I'm going to use to talk about this is Antony and Cleopatra, and I want to look at Act 2, Scene 2 in particular. This is what you need to know in terms of context. The triumvirate, the three men who share power in the Roman Empire, are meeting. There has been some tension between two of them, Mark Antony and Octavius Caesar, and this meeting has been established in an effort to sort out their differences so that they can join forces to attack the rebel Pompey. We'll enter at the moment where Maecenas, one of Caesar's followers, is explaining to Caesar and Antony very politely that they really need to bury the hatchet as there's a war on. Maecenas says, "If it might please you to enforce no further the griefs between you, to forget them quite were to remember that the present need speaks to atone you." Then Enobarbus, a follower of Antony, says what everyone's probably thinking, but no one's actually saying, that this can simply be a temporary alliance. He says, "Or, if you borrow one another's love for the instant, you may, when you hear no more words of Pompey, return it again. You shall have time enough to wrangle in when you have nothing else to do." Now, an important thing to notice here is that where Maecenas was speaking in verse, Enobarbus speaks in prose. His language is informal and inappropriate for the political formalities of the scene. It is the language of a gruff soldier rather than a politician. Antony scolds his second-in-command and tells him so. Antony says, "Thou art a soldier, speak no more." Enobarbus says, "That truth should be silent, I had almost forgot." And Antony says, "You wrong this presence, therefore speak no more." Then Caesar, speaking of course in verse, says something really interesting. He says, "I do not much dislike the matter, but the manner of his speech." That is, it's not what he's saying that's offensive, it's the way he's saying it. I know what he's saying is true, but the register he's speaking in is inappropriate. Everyone apart from Enobarbus in this passage is speaking in verse, and it's almost as though Caesar and Antony are castigating Enobarbus for speaking too directly, and with a directness that is amplified by his speaking in prose. He has wronged the presence by doing so. Now, in terms of real speech, this is a very interesting passage. Shakespeare here uses blank verse in order to create an atmosphere of formality and unease. But this does not simply mean that the language used by Maecenas, Antony, and Caesar is unrealistic. The formality of the verse is entirely suited to the politically tense, fractious, and fragile situation. If you were to sit in on a meeting at the UN, I would imagine that you'd find that the delegates don't say the first thing that comes into their heads. They may not speak in verse, in fact I'm sure they don't, but they do speak in measured, precise, politic language. Shakespeare, by using blank verse in this scene, is here creating that kind of language. And what he does to emphasize this point is to have the gruff truth-teller, Enobarbus, the man who doesn't go in for this kind of polished and careful language, speak in prose. Shakespeare, through Enobarbus, sets up a relationship between truth-telling and prose, and therefore between verse and the politic. It's by no means the case that every time someone speaks in verse in Shakespeare, they do so because they're in a politically delicate situation. But this is my point. Shakespeare uses different kinds of language in different scenes and different plays to create particular local effects. And this is the effect he wants to create in this instance. It's not enough simply to say Enobarbus' speech is real in a way that Maecenas' isn't. The point is that Shakespeare's control over language, his skill in moving between verse and prose, allows him to evoke the inhibiting nature of political discourse. The artifice of the language has allowed for a realistic, if unnaturalistic, presentation of the political world. Shakespeare frequently moves between verse and prose in his plays, and he does so for a variety of reasons. Often, and as is to some extent the case in the scene we've just been looking at, he'll have higher class characters speak in verse while lower class characters speak in prose. In this way, he manages to present class distinctions through language. At other times, though, he moves into verse because he wants to create an effect that simply cannot be created in prose. To illustrate my point, I'm actually going to stay with Act 2, Scene 2 of Antony and Cleopatra. Later in this scene, all the really important political figures, the triumvirate, walk off, and Enobarbus is left on stage with men of his own rank. Because we assume the formality of the occasion has diminished, all the characters start speaking in prose, even those who had previously been speaking in verse. They talk about Egypt, and Enobarbus is asked about this incredible woman, Cleopatra, who has stolen Mark Antony's heart. Maecenas says, "She's the most triumphant lady if report be square to her." Enobarbus says, "When she first met Mark Antony, she pursed up his heart upon the river of Cydnus." And Agrippa says, "There she appeared indeed, or my reporter devised well for her." Enobarbus says, "I will tell you." A very short line, because he's preparing a poetic set piece. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. The very man who had been speaking in truth-telling prose now speaks in this glorious poetry, rich in imagery, smooth in metre. Previously, he had interrupted verse with prose. Now he has interrupted prose with verse. Well, what do we make of this? Well, my reaction would be to suggest that it is again for local effect. This is Shakespeare's way of conveying to us the allure, the overpowering effect of the play's heroine, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. It is not really possible to describe the effect of Cleopatra in prose. She elicits poetry. You cannot say of Cleopatra's barge that its sails were purple. You must say, purple the sails. They are not perfumed, but importantly, perfumed. Cleopatra, or at least the idea of Cleopatra, is, if you will, poetical. By having Enobarbus speak these lines, Shakespeare amplifies the effect of the language, for we know that Enobarbus is no flatterer, he speaks as he sees things. And yet even Enobarbus needs to describe Cleopatra in language that is patterned, organised, and musical, a kind of verse that is, it's worth pointing out, very different to the constrained politic verse with which the scene opened. And Shakespeare, therefore, at this moment, gets across something that is tremendously important, for if we don't have a sense of the attractions of Cleopatra, we can't really understand the play. Whether or not at this point the relationship between truth and prose that Shakespeare sort of set up earlier in the scene still prevails is a question that I'll leave hanging. So to conclude, Shakespeare's characters do not use real speech. At times they seem to move towards a more realistic way of speaking, and this allows Shakespeare to create certain effects, as with the opening of Hamlet, a kind of chaos and terror, or with Iago's soliloquy, the sense that Iago is thinking while he speaks. But Shakespeare's dramatic language is always artificial in the sense of being something carefully constructed for a particular reason, to create a powerful image, as we saw in Macbeth, or to create a sense of formality, as we saw in the first passage I cited from Antony and Cleopatra, or to convey a sense of longing and exoticism, as we saw in Enobarbus' speech on Cleopatra. Shakespeare has a range of voices at his disposal. Certain situations in certain plays call for certain kinds of language, and Shakespeare uses this range of linguistic registers to establish particular atmospherics or particular dramatic effects. To use only realistic language would be to use only one instrument, where Shakespeare, by using so many different kinds of dramatic speech, offers us an orchestra. And I would like to end by suggesting that when reading Shakespeare's plays, you remain attentive to the different language he employs. Ask yourself, for what reason might this particular passage move between prose and verse? Or why is this scene composed mainly of long speeches, where this scene is composed of short pieces of dialogue? Asking such questions will help you to attain a more profound understanding of Shakespeare's art.